Welcome to Testaments with Jerry. Our collection of oral stories transforms written memories into heartfelt recordings, capturing the voices and experiences of remarkable people who wanted to share their journeys with friends, family, and loved ones. Our goal is to preserve these memories in a way that feels alive, allowing listeners to hear the warmth, wisdom, and individuality of each person's life. We also include end-of-life interviews that honor individuals' reflections and help keep their voices alive for generations to come. My name is Jerry Flanagan, and this is part 2 of an abridged version of the autobiography of an Irish traveler, detailing the author's Irish homeland and travels around the globe, including time spent back in Ireland and voyages to India, China, and Russia.
Volume 2, The Stolen Patrimony and the Turn Eastward. Chapter 9, The Limerick Usurper. My return to Ireland was not the triumphant homecoming I had envisioned while crossing the Atlantic. I arrived at my father's house in Limerick with a heart full of anticipation, only to be met by a scene of cold, bureaucratic cruelty. Upon knocking at the door of my ancestral home, I was barred entry by an elderly servant who informed me that my father had been dead for 5 weeks. Worse still, I learned that a nephew, a man I barely knew, had already administered to the estate and taken full possession of my heritage. When I was finally admitted to the library to meet this man, I was struck by his repulsive aspect. He was dark and sallow, with small, piercing eyes and an enormous mouth that gave him a look of severe vulgarity. I attempted to appeal to his humanity, explaining that I was the only son of the deceased, but he cut me off with a look of freezing contempt. He had the audacity to brand me a base-born son, claiming that my parents' marriage was illegal and that I was nothing more than a product of shame. He informed me that the law recognized him as the sole legal heir and that he felt no obligation to provide for his uncle's natural children. The shock of this accusation was a dagger to my soul. I, who had been raised with the keenest sentiments of honor and the pride of a noble name, was now a pariah in my own halls. My cousin, or rather the usurper, ordered the servants to show me to the street as if I were a common intruder. As I walked out of my own house, stripped of my fortune and my name, I felt the full weight of the misery and wretchedness that I had previously seen only in others. I found myself standing on the high road with nothing but a small bag of gold and the clothes on my back, a dispossessed wanderer once more. Chapter 10, The Steward's Revelation. While I sat in a state of stupor at a local inn, I was visited by my father's old steward, a man of deep integrity who had served our family for years. He approached me with tears in his eyes, revealing that he had been forced to take a solemn oath on the Holy Cross, never to reveal the truth of my birth. However, he had made a mental reserve during the oath, and his love for my father compelled him to speak. The steward revealed a secret history that upended everything I knew. My mother was an heiress who had married my father privately to protect a property she inherited from an uncle. According to the terms of that inheritance, she could only enjoy the estate if her husband was a Protestant. Should she marry a Catholic, the land would pass to her cousins. To preserve her livelihood, they kept their union hidden for 2 years. When the truth was finally discovered, the property was lost, and my mother died shortly after from the grief and strain. Most crucially, the steward confirmed that my father had indeed made a will, which he had witnessed alongside 2 friends. He had seen the usurper looking over this very document in the cabinet. The usurper had threatened the steward with prosecution and the loss of his wages to ensure his silence, intending to destroy or conceal the marriage certificate and the will to maintain the lie that I was illegitimate. This revelation, though it confirmed I was a beggar, restored my internal peace. I now knew that my mother's fame was unspotted and that I was the rightful heir, even if the proofs were currently held by a villain. Chapter 11, Reclaiming the Sod. Armed with the truth, but lacking the legal documents to prove it, I sought the aid of the Catholic clergy. I was introduced to a priest who knew my cousin, the son of my father's brother, who was a man of great probity and a benefactor to the poor. This relative was initially cold and distant, fearing that I was indeed the base-born son the world believed me to be. However, upon seeing my father's private letters and hearing the steward's testimony, his heart softened. The turning point came when Colonel Donovan, my kinsman from the Ligonier Valley, provided a certificate of identity swearing to my features and my parentage. This testimony, combined with the support of my religious and scrupulous relatives, finally forced the usurper's hand. After a long and arduous legal struggle, I was formally put in possession of the property left to me by my uncle and the estates of my father. I had reclaimed the sod, but the victory felt hollow in the absence of my father and the loss of my first love, Emma Doyle, who had died during my exile. Despite having secured a handsome competence, the nomadic mindset that had defined my youth returned with a vengeance. I found that I could not settle into the quiet life of a country gentleman while the world remained unexplored. My guardian, seeing my restlessness, proposed that I enter the army and seek service in India. He argued that in the East, I would see the good policy of treating conquered nations with lenity and find food for deep reflection. Thus, I resolved to turn my back on the lands I had fought so hard to reclaim, choosing the uncertainty of the road over the stability of the hearth. Chapter 12. The Tavern Philosopher. Before my departure for the East, I encountered one of the most eccentric characters of my travels, Mr. Callanan. We had been intimate in Philadelphia, and to find him in Clonmel was a shock, as he had always claimed Ireland was the one place he never wished to visit. Callanan was a man of fortune and education who had abandoned all social conventions to live entirely in taverns. To him, a tavern was the highest possible achievement of freedom and independence, a sanctuary from the trammels and snares of marriage and housekeeping. He lived by a singular schedule, rising only when the rest of the world went to bed. He once invited me to a breakfast of oysters and tortoises at midnight, arguing that a permanent house was a stopping place, and that true freedom was found only where one had no servants to manage and no children to disgrace him. He even claimed that if he ever had children, he would send them to a foundling hospital to ensure they were raised by nature rather than by the pestilential smiles of sycophants. Our discussions were a constant battle between my belief in the virtues of civilization and his cynical yet witty satire. He argued that barbarism and refinement were nearly allied, and that the higher circles of society were absorbed by avarice, pride, and vanity. Despite his absurdities, his buoyant spirit and genius were undeniable. He eventually returned to America and died in a tavern, consistent to the end. Meeting him reminded me that the road offers many different paths to independence. While I sought it through military service and global travel, he found it within the four walls of an inn, proving that travelers remain travelers even when they are sedentary. Volume 3, Eastern Wonders, Siberian Exile, and Repose. Chapter 13, Pirates in the Straits. With my patrimony secured, the nomadic mindset that defined my youth returned with a vengeance, and I resolved to seek service in India. My guardian and I secured passage on a ship bound for the East, captained by a former lawyer named Captain Cooper. The voyage began with an air of professional diligence, as I insisted on overseeing the livestock, ensuring that our poultry were not suffocated by overcrowding in the coops. However, the journey soon took a perilous turn. We were embarked upon a small vessel of only 45 tons, loaded with soap ballast, a decision I warned Captain Tonin was foolhardy. As I predicted, the vessel began to leak in heavy seas, and the soap dissolved into suds that were pumped onto the deck, leaving us dangerously top-heavy. Adding to our misery was a desperate shortage of water. We were reduced to an allowance of a single English pint per day, which I managed by perforating corks with quills so we could only draw the moisture in drops upon our tongues. It was during this state of exhaustion that we entered the Straits of Macassar and were assailed by Malayan pirates. They were ferocious and attempted to board us with the intent of making no prisoners. In the heat of the conflict, I was forced to take command of the Marines before the captain could issue orders, while my guardian used a handspike with the skill of a man born to the green sod. We repelled the boarders with such vigor that they were eventually forced to retreat, having suffered a severe lesson at our hands. Though the captain initially grumbled about my disobedience of orders, he ultimately offered his public thanks for my coolness in the face of destruction. We survived the heavy gales and the merciless surge, learning that a traveler's courage must be a mixture of heat and deliberation. Chapter 14. The Madras Establishment. Upon anchoring in Madras roads, I was struck by the arid, sandy appearance of the coast, which contrasted sharply with the vibrant, evergreen island of my birth. We were conducted into the suburbs, where our dubash, or native steward, presented us with a list of servants necessary for a household of 3 gentlemen. To my utter astonishment, the list contained 47 names. When I protested this perceived extravagance, the dubash explained that in India, a gentleman's rank was measured by his retinue. It required 30 men just to carry our palanquins and defend us from the sun with umbrellas. We eventually settled on an establishment of 43 servants, finding it bizarre that even the simplest domestic duties were divided by caste. I observed the European society of Madras with a critical eye, noting their habit of philosophically drinking wine and beer during the hottest parts of the day to expel heat, a practice that frequently led to the ravages of fever. The opulence was staggering, yet it felt artificial compared to the true, natural, undisguised merriment I had sought elsewhere. I spent my days studying the native manners and laws, as was my original intent when I first fled the misery and wretchedness of Ireland. I found the native merchants in Blacktown to be shrewd dealers in gold and pearls, living in a medley of architectural styles that combined mud walls with carved ebony. It was a land where summer rained incessantly, and the richest gifts of nature were presented spontaneously, yet it lacked the spiritual repose I craved. My guardian reminded me that such luxury was a downy lap of ease that could easily dilate a man's fortune if not managed with the economy and order learned at sea. Chapter 15. The Despotic Order of Canton. From Madras, our journey continued toward the great commercial emporium of Canton. I found the Chinese government to be strictly orderly but despotic, maintaining a rigid control over foreign merchants that made me feel more like a prisoner than a traveler. However, it was here that I encountered a truly extraordinary character, an Irish sea captain who had formerly been an outlaw and a robber. He was a hard-faced man, yet when he read my letters regarding the death of my first love, Emma Doyle, he was unmanned, and his eye pumps began to work with a fervor that proved even the roughest exterior can harbor a tender soul. He related his history to me, a tale of a stolen inheritance in Limerick, much like my own, which had driven him to a reckless indifference to life. He had joined a band of desperadoes known as the Black Band, leading them in daring expeditions and house burnings across the Irish bogs. His name became more dreaded than any other, fueled by the impious desire of revenge against the cousin who had branded him a base-born son. Yet, the news of his beloved Emma's death had eventually brought a dreadful disgust for his mode of life and a sincere repentance. He eventually escaped the gang in the disguise of a priest and sought a life of virtue abroad. Listening to him, I saw the extreme frailty of human nature and how the ebullitions of passion can subdue reason. His story was a paradox of man, a hero in danger, yet a victim of his own pride. I left Canton with a renewed resolve to remain firm in my own virtues, lest I too be swept away by the tempests of life. Chapter 16. Mauritius and the Flighty Lady. On our return passage, we stopped at the Isle of France, or Mauritius, a romantic island of broken rocks, deep ravines, and roaring cataracts. It was here that I encountered a flighty lady, the wife of a colonel, who possessed an extraordinary degree of levity. She was beautiful and well-educated, yet she delighted in provoking her husband's jealousy through playful flirtations. She even invited me to private midnight meetings in her chamber, a proposal that startled my notions of virtue, though she assured me her negress, Laura, would always be present to guard her reputation. I eventually discovered that her giddy flights were merely a mask. She loved her husband sincerely and used her flirtations to criticize the scandalous, envious society of the port. She recounted to me the romantic history of her marriage, involving a desperate battle with a runaway slave known as Nimble Catton, or the Mountain Cat, who had infested the island's mountains. Her husband, Auguste, had saved her from being kidnapped by this sanguinary ruffian during a festival at a pavilion near the cataracts. The story of their union, forged in the heat of battle and parental opposition, moved me deeply. Before we left the island, a sudden convulsion of nature, a terrible hurricane, unroofed our house, forcing us to lie flat on the ground to avoid being dashed to pieces by the wind. This experience of nature's power left me with a profound sense of my own insignificance, reminding me that man, in his pride, is no better than the reptile beneath his feet. Chapter 17. Sledges across the frozen plain. My wanderings eventually led me to the frozen expanses of Siberia. Traveling toward Tobolsk, I experienced the unique thrill of gliding over the snow in dog-drawn sledges. The drivers were often colorful storytellers, and during one long day's journey, my driver entertained me with a tale of horrors illustrating the fatal effects of jealousy and revenge. He spoke of a traveler named Moroskov and a pious host named Zarskoy, weaving a romantic fiction that seemed to spring from the very soul of the Kamchatka people. The Russian national character deeply impressed me. I found them to be religious, brave, and remarkably industrious. Contrary to the reports of superficial travelers, I observed that the Russian peasantry were among the most cheerful I had encountered. Their lords were legally responsible for their welfare, and I saw no evidence of the abject slavery found in the Americas. The society in Tobolsk was surprisingly refined, and I was frequently invited to social gatherings where the conversation was enlightened and instructive. I noted that the Russian soldiers were often delighted to share a glass with old comrades, unlike the distant officers of other nations. This nomadic portion of my life, glided silently over the frozen crust, allowed me to reflect on the wonderful order and regularity of the universe, which I had studied through the science of astronomy. It was in this remote region, where nature seems to sit alone majestic on her craggy throne, that my spiritual river began to find its peaceful delta. Chapter 18. Marriage to Daria. At a dinner in Tobolsk, my attention was arrested by a young woman named Daria, the adopted daughter of my host. She possessed an almost perfect resemblance to my lost Emma, and I found it impossible to remain indifferent to her loveliness. Daria was an orphan of respectable but poor parents, and her foster sister, Henika, treated her with a warmth that was truly angelic. As I spent more time in her company, I discovered that her personal beauty was her least endowment. Her mind was pure and unspotted. When I formally proposed marriage, I was met with unexpected opposition from her foster parents, who, out of political necessity, wished me to marry the daughter of a powerful general instead. They argued that Daria was a poor, silly country girl beneath my rank. However, I remained inflexible, asserting that Daria's virtue was a fortune in itself. Eventually, her foster father relented, placing her hand in mine and bestowing his blessing. We were married the following evening, in a ceremony according to the ritual of the Greek Church. Daria was bathed in tears as she left her foster mother, and I was obliged to carry her to our family vehicle. As we started our journey toward the capital, she fell into a profound sleep upon my bosom, and I felt myself the happiest of earthly beings. I repeated with enthusiasm the words of the poet Thomson, "Oh, happy they, the happiest of their kind, whom gentler stars unite." It was the decree of fate that I should find my partner for life in this remote region. Chapter 19. The Final Anchorage. Our homeward journey through the Russian Empire was a triumphal tour of domestic peace. We passed through Perm and Glasgow, eventually reaching the site of the vast Nizhny Novgorod Fair. There, I marveled at a miniature theater where two men managed a complicated representation of the effects of fire and water. We continued to Moscow and St. Petersburg, where we were overwhelmed by the hospitality of our Russian friends before departing for Kronstadt. In 1835, I finally returned to the Cove of Cork, anchoring safely in my native land. I was no longer the disconsolate wanderer of my youth, but a man who had secured the peace and repose of domestic happiness. I settled upon my estate, surrounded by a competent fortune and an affectionate wife who, I trust, will continue to be my companion through the evening of my days. I have fulfilled my original design to study the governments and manners of the world, and I now publish these observations for the benefit of civilization. My nomadic mindset remains, for I have learned that travelers remain travelers even when they are sedentary. My life's river, which began in the turbulent springs of Ireland and hit the rapids of the American frontier and Indian seas, has at last found its wide, peaceful anchorage. I can now look back upon my perils, safely moored under the lee of age, grateful for the protecting arm of God that has been my shield through every storm.
This concludes Autobiography of an Irish Traveler by Walter Brabazon, published in 1835. If you are interested in learning how to revitalize the memory of a forgotten loved one by sharing a short written memoir or autobiography here on this platform, please drop us a message and follow us. Thank you for listening.